What have been the effects of the availability of free video game engines? Hello, I have decided to choose what has been the effects of availability of free video game engines for my 10 to 15 minute video research presentation. In this presentation, I will show you the history of free video game engines and how they have affected the gaming community, as well as the rest of the world. What is a game engine? To understand the effects of the availability in game engines, we first need to understand what is a game engine. A game engine is a base framework that a game is created upon. They are used to create games for consoles, mobile devices, and PCs. A game engine is a software solely responsible for the game mechanics. The core functionality that the engine can provide, including a rendering engine for 2D and 3D graphics, a physics engine or collision detection and a collision response, sound, scripting, animation, artificial intelligence, networking, streaming, memory management, threading, localization support, and scene graph. Often companies will reuse/adapt the same game engine to create different game engines or make it easier to port game engines to multiple platforms. This makes things a lot cheaper for companies as it saves them in having to purchase for a different engine. Pre-game engines. Before game engines existed, games had to be written from the ground up as singular entities. A good example of this is a game for the Atari 2600 that had to be designed from the bottom up to make optimal use of the display hardware. This is referred to as kernel by retro developers today. Even if the display wasn't an issue, then the memory constraints usually sabotage the attempts to create the data-heavy design needed for an engine. Later on, though, more accommodating platforms with very little were actually usable between games, so there was little to no point in creating engines for multiple games. Therefore, throughout the 80s, games were designed with hard code rule sets, with a small number of levels and graphics data. It was common for companies to develop in-house game engines for use for first-party software. Construction kits. During the 80s, there were several 2D game creation systems produced for independent video game development. These were called construction kits, and included in these are Pinball Construction Set, released in 1983, Games Creator, released in 1984, Adventure Construction Set, released in 1984, Gary's Kitchen Game Maker, released in 1985, War Games Construction Set, released in 1986, Shoot 'em Up Construction Kit, released in 1987, and Arcade Game Construction Kit, released in 1988. Pinball Construction Set. Pinball Construction Set was released as a video game on the Apple II and the Atari 800 in 1983, later being ported to the Commodore 64 and DOS. It introduced the Builder class of games, which allowed users to drag and drop controls onto a table. These included bumpers, flippers, spinners, among other pinball apparatus. Gravity and physics could not be edited, but the user could create custom artwork on their pinball creations and save them onto floppy disks. Quake Engine. This ID Software first truly 3D engine was released in 1996 and was used for CIA operative solo missions, Hexen 2, Laser Arena, Quake, Silver Wings, and Urban Mercenary. To make sure that it wasn't too intense on the processing power, they had used a process known as Z-buffering, which only renders the areas of the map of the player is in by checking the borders made up of objects or brushes that they were called. This is halved and sometimes more than halved by the amount of polygons rendered. As well as this, they added 3D lighting source that were added with a second pass of the preprocessor, which made the Unity engine both have a great 3D look and run rather smoothly. Modern game engines. As time passed, game engines became game engines that big game developers had used had become free and more advanced than just a simple construction kit from the 80s. Here are a few examples of popular modern game engines: Unreal Engine, Unity Engine, CryEngine, Frostbite, Anvil, and Fox. Unreal Engine. Unreal is a game engine developed by Epic Games. It was first showcased in the highly popular first-person shooter game Unreal. That was released in 1998 on PC. For many years, the Unreal franchise and the Unreal Engine were going head-to-head with the Quake franchise and its engine. Although the Unreal Engine was primarily developed for first-person shooters, it quickly became popular with a variety of genres, including RPGs, MMORPGs, strategy, and others. On September the 4th, 2014, Epic released Unreal Engine 4 to schools and universities for free. That included copies for students enrolled in accredited video game development, computer science, art, architecture, simulation, and visual programs. Notable games created for the Unreal Engine are Borderlands 2, Batman Arkham City, XCOM Enemy Unknown, Bioshock, Deus Ex, and Mass Effect 2. And on the right we have images of Unreal Engine. Unity Engine. Unity Engine launched on June the 6th, 2005. The goal for the engine was to create an affordable game engine with professional tools for amateur game development, while democratizing game development industry. The three were inspired by the easy workflow, simple asset pipeline, and drag and drop interface of Apple Final Cut Pro product. When originally released, Unity was available solely for Mac OS X, and developer could only deploy their creations to a few platforms. However, with later updates, this was changed. By the way, the three that I was mentioning, I haven't changed it. I must have missed it. The three were the developers of Unity. There was three people who developed Unity. Unity began the same way Unreal Engine did, with it being an engine that you had to pay for. However, on the October the 28th, 2009, Unity Technologies announced that version 2.6 of its Unity platform is available, and that there was a feature pack that Unity is now available at no cost. Notable games created using Unity Engine: Firewatch, Subnautica, Cuphead, Hearthstone, City Skylines, Ori and the Blind Forest. Engines without innovation. It's worth pointing out that developing engines is an expensive game. To put this in perspective, Amazon spent between 50 and 70 million to license the CryEngine for their Lumberyard product. Rather than investing in the building tools themselves, this makes it more understandable when companies lag behind, especially when they have a slower release schedule than many of their competitors. Engines with innovation. Innovation can come in many forms in a game engine, from simple improvements to light and shadows, to a game which pushed the limits of hardware available on the market. As mentioned above, improving and adding to the engine is an expensive process, and companies often have to take big financial risks to pull off their ambitions. Of course, some are less willing to take the plunge than others, and this can be seen in franchises which are very repetitive in their nature. So what are my final thoughts? What have been the effects of the availability of free video game engines? Well, with the research I have conducted, I believe that game engines being free to the public has had such an impact to the gaming community as well as today's culture in general. In many ways, it has molded people into the gaming professions by giving them skills that they can then use not only to start creating games so easily, but also made education and the workplace in the gaming industry so much larger than it's ever been, with so many people developing engines. And there is my reference list and the sites I have used.